Mga matay imulat, piliin ang nararapat.
Halina at makisali sa diskusyon na ay makisuri. Kaya't sa darating na ika-9 ng Mayo,
Sa pagboto ay maging matalino.
makisali, makisuri. Hawak natin ang bukas, ipanalo natin ang Pilipinas. Makisali, makisuri. Hawak natin ang bukas, ipanalo natin ang Pilipinas. Makisuri.
I am Kevin Casasamora, Secretary General of International IDEA. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, democracy was facing severe headwinds. With the pandemic, authoritarian temptations have proliferated in many countries, and the notion that iron-fisted systems are better equipped to deal with this crisis has gained currency. In fact, many democracies around the world are showing that it is perfectly possible to deal effectively with the pandemic without giving up on basic rights that are part of our human heritage. Do not accept wooden nickels. Dealing effectively with the most fundamental human challenges requires more and better democracy, not less. It requires institutions that protect human dignity, not diminish it. We are in a twilight struggle to defend democracy from the authoritarian onslaught. Now is the time to muster the courage and build the global coalitions necessary to succeed in this struggle.
Democracy in the Asia-Pacific region is defined by cultural, political, and economic diversity. Yet recently, authoritarianism has been on the rise, with the most dramatic democratic reversals taking place in Myanmar, Hong Kong, and Afghanistan. And many countries have taken advantage of the pandemic to restrict rights, especially freedom of expression. Moreover, democracy has been eroding, especially in India, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, where ethno-nationalism, polarization, and the militarization of politics have become concerns. Still, there is resilience. Many democracies have successfully curbed the pandemic while respecting democratic principles. And countries from Vanuatu to South Korea and from Mongolia to Australia have managed to innovatively organize free and safe elections. Protests across Asia, despite the pandemic restrictions and authoritarian clampdowns, show people demand a say. Never has there been a more urgent need for democracies to deliver on their promise, rebuild trust in institutions, and prevent more decay. Visit www.idea.int to read the Global State of Democracy 2021 report.
Anong alam mo sa electoral reforms? Paano maiiwasan ang masamang epekto ng fake news at disinformation sa mga kampanya ng mga politiko? Sapat na ba ang representasyon ng kababaihan sa politika?
Hindi ito pambabae.
Balota at politika sa 2022. May bago ba? Susunod sa #Pilipilunas 2022 webinar.
"25 years ago, as walls and all world orders fell, an idea was born: to come together, to form a global coalition to strengthen and revitalize democracies, creating a catalyst of positive political energy across the planet, reinforcing the right to vote, from remote South American rainforests to rapidly expanding African megacities, helping give voice to all, regardless of gender and class, regardless of religion and ethnicity. 25 years ago, international idea was born here in Sweden. Quarter of a century later, we see democracy being challenged in unprecedented ways. We live in a world where political polarization and anger are taking center stage, where we witness rising economic inequality and the climate crisis threatens our future, where authoritarianism is no longer in retreat. Passivity and silence are not an option. Defending democracy is a collective endeavor because it protects our agency and voice at this most critical moment.
Until a decade ago, the world had witnessed democratic progress. General elections in almost all countries around the world, more than 50 countries turning into democracies, and the understanding that democracies were more likely to succeed in fighting poverty, fighting corruption, or ending civil wars. But now we live in perilous times. Lately, we have seen democracy losing ground. More autocratic governance, attempts to silence journalists and change the rule of law.
Functioning democracy in more inclusive, in a more just way is a need of today's 21st century democracy, I believe.
I had an opportunity to work with IDEA, focusing on building the Indigenous Peoples Caucus in the parliament, making the new constitution in Nepal more gender-friendly. This has to be marked as one of the landmark contribution of the IDEA International.
Social media is a challenge because it's not easy to apply jurisdiction. So we began with IDEA by receiving some help for the last 2019 general elections to provide proper monitoring to this challenge. And based on that experience, we provided then assistance to Argentina, to Dominican Republic, and to Uruguay. So we are helping each other among electoral bodies.
I think institutions like IDEA.
Welcome to the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, or International IDEA, and the University of the Philippines Department of Political Science Election Forum. What happened in the Philippine elections? The program will start in a few minutes. Please be reminded that all mobile phones must be turned off or put on silent once the program starts. For our audience joining us via Zoom, you may type in your questions using the question and answer box. Our in-person audience will also have the chance to ask their questions during the open forum. Thank you.
We're working hard to teach the value of elections to future generations.
We stand for managing electoral processes in the most challenging environments.
We stand for investigating the influence of money in politics.
More than ever, this is the time to fight for the right to electoral participation, to uphold the fundamental freedoms that are the core of our common human heritage, to strive for more representative political institutions, fairer economic structures, and more inclusive societies, where every human being has her dignity protected. Only democracy can ensure that. At a time like this, global efforts to protect democracy and human rights are essential. This is what International IDEA does. This is what it stands for. And this is why it is needed more than ever.
Mga matay imulat, piliin ang nararapat.
Halina at makisali sa diskusyon na ay makisuri. Kaya't sa darating na ika-9 ng Mayo,
Sa pagboto ay maging matalino.
makisali, makisuri, habang
I am Kevin Casasamora, Secretary General of International IDEA. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, democracy was facing severe headwinds. With the pandemic, authoritarian temptations have proliferated in many countries, and the notion that iron-fisted systems are better equipped to deal with this crisis has gained currency. In fact, many democracies around the world are showing that it is perfectly possible to deal effectively with the pandemic without giving up on basic rights that are part of our human heritage. Do not accept wooden nickels. Dealing effectively with the most fundamental human challenges requires more and better democracy, not less. It requires institutions that protect human dignity, not diminish it. We are in a twilight struggle to defend democracy from the authoritarian onslaught. Now is the time to muster the courage and build the global coalitions necessary to succeed in this struggle.
Democracy in the Asia-Pacific region is defined by cultural, political, and economic diversity. Yet recently, authoritarianism has been on the rise, with the most dramatic democratic reversals taking place in Myanmar, Hong Kong, and Afghanistan. And many countries have taken advantage of the pandemic to restrict rights, especially freedom of expression. Moreover, democracy has been eroding, especially in India, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, where ethno-nationalism, polarization, and the militarization of politics have become concerns. Still, there is resilience. Many democracies have successfully curbed the pandemic while respecting democratic principles. And countries from Vanuatu to South Korea and from Mongolia to Australia have managed to innovatively organize free and safe elections. Protests across Asia, despite the pandemic restrictions and authoritarian clampdowns, show people demand a say. Never has there been a more urgent need for democracies to deliver on their promise, rebuild trust in institutions, and prevent more decay. Visit www.idea.int to read the Global State of Democracy 2021 report.
Anong alam mo sa electoral reforms? Paano maiiwasan ang masamang epekto ng fake news at disinformation sa mga kampanya ng mga politiko? Sapat na ba ang representasyon ng kababaihan sa politika?
Hindi ito pambabae.
Balota at politika sa 2022. May bago ba? Susunod sa #Pilipilunas 2022 webinar.
"25 years ago, as walls and all world orders fell, an idea was born. To come together, to form a global coalition to strengthen and revitalize democracies, creating a catalyst of positive political energy across the planet, reinforcing the right to vote, from remote South American rainforests to rapidly expanding African megacities, helping give voice to all, regardless of gender and class, regardless of religion and ethnicity." 25 years ago, International IDEA was born here in Sweden. Quarter of a century later, we see democracy being challenged in unprecedented ways. We live in a world where political polarization and anger are taking center stage, where we witness rising economic inequality and the climate crisis threatens our future, where authoritarianism is no longer in retreat. Passivity and silence are not an option. Defending democracy is a collective endeavor because it protects our agency and voice at this most critical moment.
Until a decade ago, the world had witnessed democratic progress. General elections in almost all countries around the world, more than 50 countries turning into democracies, and the understanding that democracies were more likely to succeed in fighting poverty, fighting corruption, or ending civil wars. But now we live in perilous times. Lately, we have seen democracy losing ground. More autocratic governance, attempts to silence journalists and change the rule of law.
Functioning democracy in more inclusive, in a more just way is a need of today's 21st century democracy, I believe.
I had an opportunity to work with IDEA, focusing on building the indigenous people's caucus in the parliament, making the new constitution in Nepal more gender-friendly. This has to be marked as one of the landmark contribution of the IDEA International.
Social media is a challenge because it's not easy to apply jurisdiction. So we began with IDEA by receiving some help for the last 2019 general elections to provide proper monitoring to this challenge. And based on that experience, we provided then assistance to Argentina, to Dominican Republic, and to Uruguay. So we are helping each other among electoral bodies.
I think institutions like IDEA are very important in any society. I know for many people, the notion of democracy appears to be buried in school textbook, or is something that happens only when people go to vote. We don't often realize that as citizens, we can change the status quo.
I have the highest respect of the work of IDEA. I think through their reports and their outreach, their electoral advice to so many countries around the world, they serve an important role. We who believe in democracy have to defend it and fight for it.
We're working hard to teach the value of elections to future generations.
We stand for managing electoral processes in the most challenging environments.
We stand for investigating the influence of money in politics.
More than ever, this is the time to fight for the right to electoral participation, to uphold the fundamental freedoms that are the core of our common human heritage, to strive for more representative political institutions, fairer economic structures, and more inclusive societies, where every human being has her dignity protected. Only democracy can ensure that. At a time like this, global efforts to protect democracy and human rights are essential. This is what International IDEA does. This is what it stands for. And this is why it is needed more than ever.
Welcome to the Election Forum of International IDEA and the UP, or University of the Philippines, Department of Political Science. I am Saul Iglesias. I'm an assistant professor at the University of the Philippines, and I will be your host for today. To formally open our program, may I call on Mr. Adi Angan, Senior Program Manager of the Asia and Pacific Regional Program of International IDEA. Mr. Adi, please give your opening remarks.
Magandang hapon, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you may be. On behalf of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance and University of the Philippines Department of Political Science, I would like to welcome you, both those attending in person and online, to this event in connection with the 2022 Philippine elections. International IDEA is an intergovernmental organization with the sole mandate of supporting democracy worldwide. We have 34 member states from all continents, and I am happy to say that some of them are present here with us today. We, the Secretariat, thank our member states for their continued support and guidance. This event aims to provide the opportunity for various election observer groups to discuss their findings with one another, and also to answer any questions you, the audience, may have. I would like to thank the observer groups present today, and also for their willingness to take part. Without you, this event would not have been possible. Last but not least, I wish to thank University of the Philippines Department of Political Science for your willingness to partner with us yet again. We value your friendship. That's it from me. Hope you all have a rewarding discussion. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adi. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator. Our moderator is a multi-awarded political journalist and educator. He is the host of Facts First, a political talk show that tackles burning issues on politics and governance and is devoted to combating disinformation, no holds barred. He is the former anchor of the hard-hitting program After the Fact on the ABS-CBN news channel. Our moderator began his career as a reporter with the Philippine Daily Inquirer before joining ABS-CBN as a news correspondent and anchor. He currently teaches political reporting and journalism ethics at the University of Santo Tomas. Everyone, please welcome Mr. Christian Isguera.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christian, and welcome to, I see some familiar faces in the crowd. Well, nice to see you guys here. This is a very important discussion for this afternoon because we know, not to overstate the obvious, this is can be considered as perhaps the most consequential elections here in the Philippines in recent history. And today we're going to talk about not just the credibility of the elections that just happened, that just took place last Monday. We also talk about the nitty-gritty of the elections and what we can do moving forward in terms of improving our systems in terms of elections. So at this point, we would like to welcome our members of the panel. We'll start with the representative from the Asian Network for Free Elections, or ANFREL, a group or an international multi-sector, independent, and nonpartisan alliance of like-minded organizations working together to advance a common vision that every state should have a government whose authority derives from the will of the people as expressed by secret ballot in genuine, free, and fair elections. Let's all welcome Mr. Rohana Hitayarachi. He is the Secretary General of ANFREL, rather. Next, we have a representative from the Carter Center, a group that seeks to prevent and resolve conflicts, enhance freedom and democracy, and improve health. Please welcome the team leader of the Carter Center, Mr. Peter Wardle. Next is a representative from the group Contra Daya. This is an election watchdog here in the Philippines. It is considered as an independent citizens poll watchdog guarding against electoral fraud, violence, and other undemocratic practices during the election period. We would like to welcome a convener of Contradaya, Miss Maria Lourdes Toralbe Harabe. Now, representing the Legal Network for Truthful Elections, or LENTE, this is a group that is the first and only non-partisan nationwide network of lawyers, law students, paralegals, and grassroots volunteers engaged to do election work. Please welcome the Executive Director of LENTE, Attorney Rona Ann Caritos. Last but definitely not the least, representing the National Citizens Movement for Free Elections, or NAMFREL, the pioneer in election monitoring. This group started the establishment of Operations Registrations Committee in 1957. This has a long track record in monitoring Philippine elections. We would like to welcome the Systems Group Head of NAMFREL, Mr. Lito Averia. Okay, so this is a very interesting discussion for this afternoon because we're going to talk about the elections. I'm not sure about the feelings of the people here in the room or people watching us on social media. But first, let's talk about the basic matters here for this first segment because we have 3 segments for this entire program. First, people are asking how credible were these elections that took place last Monday. Of course, in any elections in the Philippines, as they say, there are no losers in the Philippines, only cheated candidates. But let's ask the watchdogs, okay? How credible were the elections? Let's start with Mr. Rana. You can use this.
Good afternoon. First of all, I wish to thank International IDEA for organizing such important discussions to share our experience in Filipino national and local elections. And also, I wish to say a few words about ANFL. I know most of you are aware about ANFL, but in case if someone doesn't know about ANFL, so just the few points, what is ANFL? We established in 1997. It's a network organization based in Thailand. We have been working across Asia. We observe more than 70 elections in our region. And in this mission, and of course the Philippines, we have our partners. As he correctly mentioned, the NAMFREL is one of the pioneers for us for the elections. And NAMFREL, LENTE, PPCRV, IFA, those are our organizations, the network partners here in NAMFREL. I will brief about our missions also because we had a very short window to observe the elections. But there were 15 observers across the country. And we were managed to observe 14 regions, and on the elections day, we observe 197 clustered prisons. So all our report based on that limitations. I'm not going to elaborate the whole report which we have issued today because I know that our local colleagues, our partners, they may come up with the real picture because they have a bigger network across the country. But I will highlight a couple of issues which we have identified and we think that has to be addressed in the coming elections by the authority. So one of the issue is, I have highlighted 5 issues. The one is the secrecy of the ballot. That is fundamental right of the citizens, the voters, wherever the elections take place. But in these elections, we have seen, we have observed, witnessed, most of the polling stations, they have not taken it seriously. So observers, political party agents, even the citizens, even they were outside the classroom, easily they can see which party, which candidate the voters are voting. And of course, the layout of the polling stations also affect, because the voting machines, when the voters voting, feeding their ballot papers to the machines, those who are in the lineup, they can easily notice the voters' choice. So that is one of the area where we need to seriously thought about before next any elections. We have seen in the past also, but as ANFREL we have observed more than 70 elections throughout Asia, but this is one of the area where Philippines need to take serious thought. And the technical issues, the BCM machines, the technical issues also, even though it's not a, I mean, compare with the total machines, we have noticed, or we have got the information, observed, 1.6 machines during the elections, on the elections day, were broken. And some places, voters has to wait 12 hours. They had a choice to vote manually and hand over to the ballot papers to the polling officials. But most of them, we need to salute those voters, most of them were not happy to hand over it to someone else, because there was no guarantee, and also it's based on the trust. That is also the considerable issue, the trust, because whatever the system, whatever the elections, whatever the country, the main issue is the trust. The main, all the authority and the voters, all the stakeholders has to serious on the trust. If the people don't trust, if the citizens or voters don't trust with the system or authority, no point, whatever the mechanism, it can be manual elections, it can be automated elections, the trust is most important. We have seen, or we have witnessed, with our observations, the people trust is a big issue here. Okay. So I will finish, yeah, give me two minutes. Then the vote buying, I'm not going to elaborate, I think everyone knows that. That also large scale, even though you can't find the hard evidence, because the candidate and anyone can come up with many excuses, but that also the critical issue. Because it will prevent equal playing field. Those who have money power, they get more advantage. And it will create, beyond the elections also, it will create corruptions. People don't understand that when you accept the bribe, when you accept the money or what kind of, any kind of bribes, it will take from the voters, the citizens' pocket. The last one, delay of response of the COMLEC. Dispute resolutions mechanism is not passed. No point, just get whatever their opinion, if it's not coming in the given time, and we have noticed this, one of the main candidates' qualifications were challenged, but they come after the elections. So if we got the different opinion from the previous, what will happen after the election? So we have to have this proper dispute resolution mechanism from the COMELEC side, and voters need to alert on that, and it should be very fast, very quick system during elections, because this is where we are talking about very short period. So those are critical points which we wanted to highlight here as sample. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, for those observations. Next, we would like to hear from Mr. Peter Pardo.
Is that? Thank you. Again, I would like to begin by thanking International IDEA for organizing this opportunity for us to share our initial impressions from our time in the Philippines, and to thank the people of the Philippines for welcoming us to what is one of the most important exercises in their democracy. The Carter Center's mission was not a traditional observation mission. We were a very small team, and our focus was on two particular aspects of the elections in the Philippines. They were the role of technology in the voting process, and also the framework for regulating campaign finance, money in politics. In both these areas, the Philippines actually have been ahead of many other countries. So the Philippines is one of the countries to use technology on a large scale in their elections, in their voting process, much earlier than many other countries. And the Philippines enacted the main components of its campaign finance regulations as long ago as the 1980s, which again is much earlier than many countries. Some countries have still not got any real provisions around campaign finance. So we came and we come not just to bring other ideas, but also to see what we can learn from the experience of the Philippines as it's been on a journey in these two areas particularly. The small and expert nature of our mission means that we did not set out to and have not been able to form an overall impression of every aspect of the election process. But I will share a few impressions that we've had. First of all, it was impressive to see the very widespread levels of participation across the country. And I would particularly note that these elections were conducted against the background of the pandemic and the challenges that that brought. And it is a particular set of challenges for any election management body, particularly given some of the processes that are in place and the difficulty of ensuring that the balance of health requirements and participation requirements are well met. It's been a particular difficulty and challenge for election bodies across the world, and I think it's right to acknowledge that COMELEC made a good effort, I think, to balance and respond to this as best they could, although it was almost impossible to be perfectly to perfectly observe all of the health requirements as at the same time as perfectly observing every aspect of the electoral requirements. But it was good to see that in the thinking around the election, the priority of allowing people to cast their vote, if at all possible, was plain to see, and I think that was a good thing. In general, we found in our analysis of the election process that there were no significant gaps in the process, and in particular, to pick up the theme of trust. We were impressed by the fact that in the Philippines there are a number of mechanisms which are running either alongside or as a check on the automated voting to help to build trust in the process. Those checks are still being carried out, of course, but I think it's worth noting that, as has been said, in any election system, whether manual or automated, the importance of having these checks is vital. And although we will have something to say under the issues section about possible improvements, it's reassuring, I think, to see that so many checks are in place, and particularly the very important role of civil society in the conduct of those checks. So I refer, for example, to the random manual audit, to the whole process around the transparency survey. And I think we were encouraged to see the important role that's played by civil society. We have a few observations and recommendations to make, but I will leave those until the next segment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Peter. Now, we can go to the specifics. Those were the observations. How about on the part of Contra Daya, Malu? You came out with a very detailed report on what happened on election day based on your monitoring.
Okay, before I thank you to IDEA and UP Diliman for inviting us to have this opportunity to converse with you about that question that you asked. I think it's difficult to be confident about the results of the elections, because we were able to gather numerous complaints on the ground. Okay, so what are these? We were able to gather more than 4,000 reports of fraud and election-related violence. And of these number, 1,370 have been verified. Okay, so when verified, that would mean we have the context, we have photos and videos. We checked these reports, and of these number, 42% of these incidents would involve machine failures. Okay, so the VCM. So I think for the most part, with this widespread reports of machine errors and breakdowns, it's really difficult to be confident. It's really difficult to be confident that the election proceedings went very smooth. So we have our doubts about that, and I think COMELEC has to, explain about these.
Okay. If I may ask a quick follow-up to that response of yours, those incidents that you were able to verify, do you think they were enough to somehow put in question the credibility of the entire process? Because according to Peter, there were no significant gaps in the whole process.
I come from the point of view of voters. So if you would ask voters, it would be difficult for them to fully trust, or to be, the word I used is to be confident about the results of the elections.
Okay.
Now, I'm not saying don't trust, we didn't trust, but it's hard to be confident. So I think we should make a distinction between the two words.
Are you talking of the local results or the national, the presidential election results?
Both.
The entire thing?
Let me qualify it this way. There were reports, and in our point of view, with the errors, with the machine errors, with the VCM errors, it casts doubt, whether these machines are really able to count the votes.
Okay, let's hear from Lente. Do you share the same opinion?
Thank you, Christian, for the question.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Didier. Thank you to UP for giving us this opportunity to talk about our observations last Monday. And just to answer your question, Christian, it's credible but with reservation, because Lente is not yet done with the process. We're still about to undertake random manual audit
Random manual audit is one polling place is selected per legislative district, randomly selected, and these polling places will be manually counted. So our random manual audit teams will go over all the physical ballots and compare the manual count to the machine count. This is to check the accuracy of the count of the machine. So I'm answering Christian's question with, it's credible but with reservation. So I can't make a definite statement yet unless we're done with the conduct of the random manual audit. But going back to our observations last Monday, the top 3 problems that we encountered and that was reported to us: 1, breakdown of machines; 2nd, missing names of voters in the voters list; and 3rd is the lack of familiarity of the support staff as to, for example, the procedure in the emergency accessible polling place, or the familiarity with what will happen if the machine breaks down. What are the options given to the voters? And most of the time, on election day, we were receiving reports. Our hotlines were not, hindi tumitigil yung hotlines namin, and we were just receiving calls of voters asking us what will happen if the machine breaks down. Are we allowed to just wait for the machine to be repaired, or we're being pressured to just vote and leave the ballot to one of the electoral board members? So those were the top 3 problems that we encountered on election day. Of course, there's a usual problem with vote buying, with unlawful electioneering, the most committed election violations before and on the day of the elections. But what's striking in the conduct of our elections last Monday is the will of the people to actually fight and be vigilant about their votes. This was the first time that, of course, we've had automated elections for 12 years already. I don't know if you remember, but 12 years ago, we had our first fully automated election system, and we always encounter breakdowns, di ba? We always encounter breakdowns every election. But this is the first time that voters are really adamant. They're really forcing the way that they'll wait for the machine to be repaired, or they'll wait that they be the one to insert the ballot into the VCM and wait for the resibo or the VVPAT. So I think it tells us that people are more vigilant and that they're more engaged in this election. So I think that's one of the highlights in the elections last Monday. Despite all of the problems encountered, we saw how people were more vigilant and were more adamant in protecting their votes.
Okay.
So thank you, Christian.
So that's clear. Credible with reservations.
Yes.
Until you saw the results of the
random
manual audit. Okay. Let's hear from the tech guy in the room. How credible were these elections from your perspective, given the reports about those glitches?
Again, credibility is a perception, right? How do you perceive it means? But on the tech side, it's really tied up with the integrity of the system and its accuracy. Okay. Sadly, with the issues coming out today, like this 62-38 pattern or the 47% pattern, you know? So people are asking, that's impacting on the credibility of the elections. You know? So sadly, what more can I add? These observations, they summarized, they enumerated all the observations that we had, right? Like the machine malfunctions. That also would impact on the credibility of the elections. But even before the elections, you know, credibility is also tied up again with transparency, not only transparency of the system, but transparency of the management body, which is the commission, right? A few weeks before, there were hearings at the Senate, and you know the resource persons were crying out loud about the transparency of the process, like being unable to observe, for example, ballot printing and the preparation of the SD cards. You know? So after that, then suddenly, COMELEC opened up the places for observation, right? This year, first time, they revealed the locations of the servers that are being used. They've been so secretive about those locations, but for several years we were demanding, right, for them to be more transparent. So if there's lesser transparency, it's going to be impact on the credibility of the election. So it really is a challenge.
Okay, you mentioned that so-called 6832 magic. It's all over social media, and I think some of you are going to ask that also. Let's hear from you. Help us make sense of that, because you also saw statisticians clarify that matter, that it was not really out of the ordinary if you're talking of big data. But from your perspective, what do you think?
Well, it's, again, the explanation is really statistical. There's statistical laws or theories that govern the behavior of the data. So we have over 106,000 VCMs, over 106,000 results of the elections. So at the beginning, you'd see percentages, right, or margins of differences. And that would narrow down as more election results come in, resulting into an almost even percentage of difference. Okay? It's either what we call the law of large numbers or the limiting, the limiting theorem, that it goes to an average. Right? How do I explain that further? You have more samples, 106,000 samples, so it will result into the margins being consistent. But if you look at the breakdowns, so for example, if you consolidate by cities and municipalities or by provinces, the gap would be wider.
Yeah.
But as you pull this together at the national scale, the gaps would be more refined.
Okay. So to be clear, can that be taken as evidence or indication of possible fraud?
No, not at all.
Malu, would like to add to that.
Well, not directly, but we can probably say that there's, how do you say that, anomalous. Do you agree?
Again, it's a perception.
It's a perception. Okay, but anomalous in the sense that, how could that be? How is that possible?
Oh, we had that 60-30-10 pattern back in 2010, right? But when that was raised, because the winner was favored by a lot, then that 60-30-10 pattern was just brushed aside. But this time around, it did not meet people's expectations. And I might say, right, these elections is more emotional. A lot of voters were emotionally invested in the elections, right? So, as an anomaly, then depends on the perception of the voters if it's anomalous or not. But hard facts are that the numbers are there, the results are what they are,
okay,
and you start computing, then again, the margins would fall into some kind of consistency as you gather more data in the pool.
Let's also hear from our observers. Did you just monitor the activities on election day, or did you also go to the extent of monitoring the transmission and also somehow monitored that so-called 6832 magic or phenomenon? Peter, would you like to go first?
We did not set out to monitor the results to this level of detail, but we did look closely at the processes for transmitting results, because to go back to the theme of trust, there are perhaps a few obvious questions that any voter is going to ask themselves. The first question is, has my vote been correctly recorded in the polling station? The secondly is, has my vote been correctly counted in the total for that polling station? And then, of course, has the total for that polling station been correctly transmitted into the national counting process? And it's at each of these stages that it's very important to have checks that people understand and can have confidence in. And to just pick up the discussion of statistics, one of the suggestions that we are forming in our mind, although we've not made a formal report yet, is that it may be, this is a consequence of the fact that the Philippines has been voting using technology for a long time now. The debate and the expertise around the statistical methodology and the ways in which that can be even further enhanced and clearly explained is moving on around the world. And so in any gathering of election observers, the first thing that the observers say is to remind the election management body that before they start worrying about the next election, it's good to make a thorough review of what lessons have been learned at this election, while it's fresh in everybody's mind and while the concerns are fresh. And as part of that, a suggestion from us is that it's a good time now for the Philippines to think about whether there are improvements that can be made to the processes that check on the results transmission, because there are ways, we believe, in which those can be made more reliable. Can I say something about the ballot secrecy question as well? Because we too noticed it was very striking when you go in and watch the way in which people vote in the Philippines. Very striking how little attention is given to ballot secrecy. The Constitution of the Philippines very clearly requires secrecy in the process. Yeah. And so we were very interested to see how much acceptance there was actually among everybody and how few complaints there were about the fact that there were not many careful provisions to ensure secrecy. What was particularly interesting was when the machines broke. Because although what we observed was that voters were content with the processes, in many cases they were content to hand their ballot paper to a member of staff to feed through the machine. They didn't necessarily use the secrecy sleeve. The secrecy sleeve is too small anyway to cover the ballot paper. And so when they're in the polling station and they can see that their ballot is under control, it seemed that voters were not so worried about the possibility that someone might see it. But when they were given the choice either to wait for many hours in some cases or to leave their completed ballot with somebody else, they were clearly, as far as we could observe, they were less comfortable with that. And so machines will always break. Clearly, there needs to be, COMELEC needs to look at how long it took to address those issues, because in some cases it was surprisingly long. And this seems to us to be largely a question of logistics and preparation as well as dealing with the incident on the day. But I think what is striking is that the voters had no option which gave them confidence that nobody would interfere with their ballot paper, on the one hand, and that it would definitely get into the count, even if they weren't there. So a broken machine raises some questions about the process, which I think should be addressed. The other observations I have are to do with other areas, so I'll let others speak.
Okay. I think Madu would like to comment.
Yeah. Yes, just to, 2 points. One, you mentioned about as part of the law, the secrecy, yes? But there's also another element there, public count. No? So to dispel all these credibility, throwing credibility questions, maybe there should be more measures to be, more transparency mechanisms should be put in place so that we are able to answer all these credibility issues or gaps pertaining to not just these elections, the upcoming. The second is regarding the machines. Please note, based on our study or monitoring, these vote counting machines have been used since 2010. So this is already, 2016, so 5 years. Third election. So, the wear and tear. Even the COMELEC said, even Commissioner George Garcia said that they won't be using the same machines in 2025. No? So there's, what is that an indication of? Okay, and number two, related to that point, in 2019, there were 7,000 VCM machines on standby should there be, if the machines break. But in 2022, there were only 2,000, if I am not mistaken. So looking at all these figures, I think there should be a tightening of the nuts and bolts somewhere in terms of the systems and processes. But also, bottom line is how do we make it more transparent so that we are able to answer questions of credibility, trustworthiness, no, of the whole process.
Okay, I'd like to ask Attorney Ona first. I think we can all agree that there were instances of election fraud in this particular election, similar to what had taken place in previous electoral cycles in the Philippines. But my question is, were those cases enough to put the credibility of the entire exercise in question? Or, this is an unpopular question, you mentioned that this is a very emotionally charged campaign and election. Do you also get the sense, Attorney Ona, that people are assailing the outcome simply because they could not accept the result?
I agree with your second statement, Christian, that people are assailing the outcome because they don't agree with the results. Because just like what I said earlier, people are more invested in this election. We saw that in last Monday's conduct of the election, that people really are not agreeing to just give their ballots to one of the members of the Electoral Board. So I think that's one of the reasons why we see all of this posts about 62-38, the 47 plus. So I think that's one of the reasons. So as to prosecution, just to add to the transparency issue, I think COMELEC also has to explain why it took a longer time for the machines to be repaired or for the SD cards to be replaced. Because just like what I said earlier, the machines break down every election. That's not a new thing in Philippine elections. But what was different again in the last Monday's elections was how long the response was of COMELEC in repairing the machines or replacing the SD cards. Because if you compare it to previous elections, for example, 2019, we did not have a case of elections still taking place up to the following day.
Yeah.
Because we had a number of cases of people still waiting for their turn to vote to shade the ballots just because the machines haven't arrived. The replacement machines haven't arrived or the SD cards haven't arrived. So COMELEC really has to explain what happened during that time, what was their protocol, what was the time response of them to the different machines breaking down on the day of the election. So I think COMELEC has to be transparent on that aspect of the elections as well last Monday.
Okay. Mr. Aberia, would like to add?
Yeah, well, a lot of points have been discussed about transparency, but NAVREL has been advocating for a more transparent elections. You know, when you automate the elections, it becomes a black box. When you when you insert your ballot into the machine, you don't see anything. Okay? Yes, you might see your VVPAT. This is the voter verifiable paper audit trail, or we call the recibo, right? But what happens in between, we don't see it. In manual elections, we used to see how the ballots were scrutinized and appreciated, how the ballots were recorded, or the votes were recorded on the tally board and the tally sheet, how the votes were counted, and how the ERs or the election returns were prepared. But with the automated elections, we don't see those anymore. Even the transport of the election returns is now electronic, so that we don't see where it goes. Okay? So it's at the endpoints that are the things that we see. Right? So we've been advocating for a more transparent system.
Okay. Thank you for those observations. We're not yet done. We're just getting started. But we're going to take a quick break. Afterward, we're going to ask even more specific questions in this panel discussion. Stay with us.
I am Kevin Casasamora, Secretary General of International IDEA. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, democracy was facing severe headwinds. With the pandemic, authoritarian temptations have proliferated in many countries, and the notion that iron-fisted systems are better equipped to deal with this crisis has gained currency. In fact, many democracies around the world are showing that it is perfectly possible to deal effectively with the pandemic without giving up on basic rights that are part of our human heritage. Do not accept wooden nickels. Dealing effectively with the most fundamental human challenges requires more and better democracy, not less. It requires institutions that protect human dignity, not diminish it. We are in a twilight struggle to defend democracy from the authoritarian onslaught. Now is the time to muster the courage and build the global coalitions necessary to succeed in this struggle.
Democracy in the Asia-Pacific region is defined by cultural, political, and economic diversity. Yet recently, authoritarianism has been on the rise, with the most dramatic democratic reversals taking place in Myanmar, Hong Kong, and Afghanistan. And many countries have taken advantage of the pandemic to restrict rights, especially freedom of expression. Moreover, democracy has been eroding, especially in India, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, where ethno-nationalism, polarization, and the militarization of politics have become concerns. Still, there is resilience. Many democracies have successfully curbed the pandemic while respecting democratic principles. And countries from Vanuatu to South Korea and from Mongolia to Australia have managed to innovatively organize free and safe elections. Protests across Asia, despite the pandemic restrictions and authoritarian clampdowns, show people demand a say. Never has there been a more urgent need for democracies to deliver on their promise, rebuild trust in institutions, and prevent more decay. Visit www.idea.int to read the Global State of Democracy 2021 report.
Mga matay imulat, piliin ang nararapat.
Halina at makisali sa diskusyon na ay makisuri. Kaya't sa darating na ika-9 ng Mayo,
Sa pagboto ay maging matalino.
makisali, makisuri. Hawak natin ang bukas, ipanalo natin ang Pilipinas. Makisali, makisuri. Hawak natin ang bukas, ipanalo natin ang Pilipinas. Makisuri.
Okay, welcome back to our panel discussion about the recently concluded Philippine elections. We had very specific discussions earlier, but we would also go more into specifics. Okay, I'd like to ask Mr. Rohana. By the way, how many observers did you have last Monday? And the observations that you mentioned during our discussion earlier, were they focused more on the process which happened before the transmission, for example? Meaning what took place before the ballot was actually fed into the machine?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we had only 15 observers across the country.
Okay.
We were managed to cover 197 clustered polling prisons. All our observations based on that. I think our local partners, they may have a larger coverage, but with that limitation, yes. The election means it's not only the elections day, it's the process. If you talk about the free and fair elections, there are a lot of elements. So it goes to appointment of the elections commissions, it goes to party registrations. So there are many things we have to discuss. But if you limit in certain, the election process, the voter registration is one of the key. Do we have an accurate voter registry? Whether each and every voters do have access to their registrations. Is there anyone is out of the system? Or anyone went without voting on the elections day? So registrations, accurate voter list is one of the key. Then the pre-election period, how the campaign process, whether we do have a equal playing field. Campaign finance is part of it, but we have noticed that some of the parties, they didn't get the space for them to organize their meeting. So the whole campaign process is also part of the free and fair elections, because we notice the government resources are misused by some of the candidates. So those who are in the power, I'm saying it's not only Philippines, it's in our regional practice, but those are factors in pre-election period. So election day process, whether it is transparent, whether voters have access to their polling stations, is there any blocking, or whether the disabled vote, I mean each and every voters. The elections means it's all inclusive. So all the voters should have a equal access to their polling stations. The system should be very transparent. And we notice in the election day process, yes, it's transparent, but unfortunately, the voting also transparent, ballot papers also transparent. So we were able to see the voters marking their ballot. Okay. Then the counting, it has to access for observers, political parties, and it should be transparent. And until you announce the result, and for example, it take longer period to announce the result, then it will, the confidence of the voters, confidence of the political party, trust of the political party will be an issue. So it's the whole process. So we managed to observe the pre-elections period, but with a very short period.
Okay. Okay. There's a question for Attorney Ona. What happens if there are discrepancies during the random manual audit?
It depends on the number of discrepancies. If it exceeds 10 discrepancies, then the ballot box will be subjected to a root cause analysis by the technical evaluation committee. But if the discrepancies is less than 10, then it will just be accepted. That's the accepted number of variants between the manual count and the machine count, 10 or less. But if it exceeds 10, then it will be subjected to a root cause analysis by the technical evaluation committee. But in the previous RMA, out of the 715 polling places randomly selected, only 2 polling places were subjected to a root cause analysis in the 2019 midterm elections. So most of the polling places or the ballot boxes randomly audited, for example, in the 2019 midterm elections, passed the threshold capacity for the minimum variance for the audited ballot boxes.
Okay. I think this is also a question directed to you, Attorney Ona. Procedural. Okay. What if voters would like to protest the result before the proclamation? Is there any mechanism for that?
Pre-pro.
Meaning ordinary voters, they don't accept the unofficial results. And before the official proclamation, can they do anything about that?
Based on the rules that we have, the pre-proclamation protest can only be done on the ground of the illegal composition of the Board of Canvassers. Unlike before in manual elections, pre-proclamation cases can be on the grounds of illegally or on the grounds of manufactured ERs or election returns. So that was before in the manual system of election. But now, ever since we automated our elections, pre-proclamation cases can only be done on the ground of illegal composition of the Board of Canvassers.
Okay. Let's ask Peter. Did you also monitor the canvassing on the ground?
No, we can't claim to have done any analytical monitoring of the canvass simply because of resources and because of the fact that we concentrated on understanding the processes that were being carried out, not just by Comelec. We took a particular interest in the processes that were carried out by citizen organisations, because it seems to us to go back to the opening remarks that the effectiveness of the processes that are in place to provide checks and confidence in the results that are being transmitted through the system are extremely important. And as somebody said just now, this would be true in a manual system as well. I mean, if you had a manual voting count where you took all the ballot boxes into a locked room, waited 24 hours and then came out and said, here is the result, everyone would need a way of checking why they should believe that. And exactly the same is true with an automated count. You have to have a system which demonstrates that the results that the count has produced are credible and can be traced back to the component parts at each step, so that the ballot papers in the box, the transmission of results. And this is where, from our observation, we think there are likely to be some significant benefits for the Philippines in taking time to think about what improvements can be made, not because we're saying that there's a major difficulty at the moment, but because we think that the processes in place, having been used for many years now, it's a good time to check how new techniques and new understandings from around the world, as more and more countries face the same issue, there are emerging methodologies and emerging learning which we think could significantly benefit the Philippines, particularly against the background of people asking questions about how good the system is.
Okay.
Let's look at how it can be improved at every step.
Okay, thank you. By the way, some of our audience are requesting if you could speak closer to the microphone later on. Okay, yeah, they're very interested with your response. Malu, would you like to respond to this next question? Also, we would like to hear from Namfrel. Is there a way to make the COMELEC accountable, to hold them accountable with all those glitches that we experienced? I think your count was 1,800 VCMs, right?
Yes, okay. 1,800 VCMs. And if we count it by the number of voters per VCM, that would be, what, 620? So that would be more than 1 million. I'm not saying disenfranchised, but rather these would be potential cases of disenfranchisement. Okay, so that's quite a lot. And I think COMELEC should not downplay, because right? No, each vote is important, and for these to reach that number, so that's more than 1 million. I think that's significant. That is a significant number to be concerned about.
Okay.
And so COMELEC should look into this, should be answerable to this, no? And also Smartmatic, okay, and what's this? F2 Logistics. Okay, how well did they prepare for this? No, they were given a huge contract, right? They know it's election season already, election cycle. They've been given enough time to prepare, and they promised to us that they are in control. No, they are prepared, well prepared. But the results show otherwise. Okay, with all I've seen the people lining up. The videos sent to us, like 10 kilometers of people lining up outside their polling precincts, polling places. So what is that an indication of?
Okay.
So I think, we have to, this is evidence-based, by the way. This is not anecdotal anymore, because we have gathered the data, we have verified the reports, and we are closely looking into the details. So I think this is not anecdotal anymore. The fact that it is being it's the same observation that you got. So I think it's serious, and we do not want this to happen again in the next election cycle. So COMELEC should, wisen up.
Okay. Mr. Aberia.
Well, in terms of accountability, sure. we should hold them accountable for whatever inconveniences or glitches or malfunctions that occurred during election day. Especially among the senior citizens or the PWDs. A lot of the senior citizens were actually disappointed, especially those who were on wheelchairs or had canes, that they are not able to go to their regular precinct to vote because they had preferred to insert their ballots into the machine.
Since you mentioned the situation of the senior citizens, including persons with disabilities, there's a related question to that. Let's move the discussion further. What can we do to improve the situation in subsequent elections?
Well, since we automated the elections anyway, we can look at the situation where you can vote anywhere, right? Because the registered voter can have an ID, right? Let's say a voter registration number. And then the places where he is registered to vote, if he's from a city or municipality, let's say in Batangas, then again, those can be tagged and identified. So you can link those identification tags, the voter identification tags and the jurisdiction tags, right, together. So that, and then he's presented with it's no longer going to be a paper ballot. It's going to be a touch screen thing, right? So that the system will present to him, to the voter, when he enters his ID, will present him to the appropriate ballot. And that's where the voter verifiable paper audit trail comes in handy.
Okay.
Actually, the VVPAT requirement is related to that kind of system. Right? We only implemented the VVPAT here because it's in the law.
Okay. Attorney.
I want to answer your question because we've talked about this in the office. There's an overlook provision in the Civil Code, and it provides at Article 32 that any public officer or employee who directly or indirectly obstructs, defeats, violates, or any manner impedes or impairs any of the following rights, and including the right of suffrage, shall be liable, of another person shall be liable to the latter for damages. So any interested voter out there who was deprived of his or her right to vote or who was disenfranchised can use this article, this overlook article in our Civil Code, Article 32, to file for damages.
Against who?
COMELEC. Because it's any public officer or employee who directly or indirectly impedes on the exercise of the right and liberty of person shall be liable to the latter for damages. Okay. So freedom of suffrage is part of the liberties and
bad news for COMELEC. Okay.
There's a lawyer, I think, who will be interested in the room, will be interested in that case.
Malu would like to add to that.
I have a question, Attorney Ona. So what about if uniformed personnel or state agents are stationed outside of the polling precincts and distributing flyers, asking voters, sample ballots, not to vote for particular candidates, or maybe have red tagged certain candidates groups. So what do we do with them?
In that instance, they committed 2 election offenses. 1, unlawful electioneering, because it's not allowed to distribute election flyers on election day. 2nd, if they're uniformed personnel, they're not allowed also to engage in partisan political activities. So they're liable for 2 election offenses.
Okay, because we have, it's actually a report. In one of the polling places in Pampanga, there's a table being manned by uniformed personnel, and they were, on top of the table, were paraphernalia, flyers saying that these group, are front organizations, you shouldn't vote for them.
Maybe they did not understand that part of our definition of campaigning under legal framework is campaigning for, campaigning against, and not voting at all in the election. So they're really liable.
So we can file a case. Well, we can file a case. So we've heard that. Thank you.
Let's go to the elephant in the room, because our observers naturally observe the electoral process on election day, right? What about the process that came before, the campaign? I'd like to ask about the problem of disinformation. How big a role do you think disinformation played in this particular election? Peter, would you like to respond to that, or Rohana? Okay.
I ought to say, as you know, that we've not set out to monitor the entire campaign. So it's really impossible for me to comment on from any observational experience on the particular campaign here in the Philippines. That's not to say that I don't know about it. I've seen the discussion, and I would absolutely reinforce the comments of Anne Frel that the campaign, what comes before election day, what comes after election day, it's not simply about what happens at the polls. And the one area which is relevant to this, which we have looked at, has been the framework to regulate the spending of campaigners at the elections in the Philippines. And I can say that in that area, the very short period before election day in the Philippines, when campaigners are required to report and to be open about their income and expenditure, is very noticeable and seems unlikely to be the best answer. So we will certainly have something to say about that. The other noticeable factor in the Philippines is that although a lot of information is reported to COMELEC as the regulator, I think we believe that a lot more could be done, not just by COMELEC, but in partnership perhaps with civil society and with tech providers, to learn from the experience in other countries about the ability to make that information much more accessible to citizens and others, and put it out there, share it. This is important information about what is going on. COMELEC has real difficulty in terms of its resources and its skills in investigating all of this and analysing it, but a possible step forward would be to enlist the support of wider society in looking and analysing at that information and starting to build a debate about what is happening here. Because transparency in elections, particularly transparency, it's not just about the processes, which is what we've talked about up to now, it's also about the campaigning techniques and the funding of those campaigning techniques. And certainly what we have seen in many other countries is that when that information becomes much more accessible and transparent, a different debate begins. Okay. But as long as it's hard to get at and hard to understand, it's hard to discuss as well.
Okay. Rohana.
Yeah, I endorse what my friend already said. In ANFREL, we did not have a mechanism to observe these social media, but we realized even just before we sit here, there are about 80% of the people in this country using mobile phone, right? And the source of information, one of the key information source is the social media. So the one area where we can cover up by the authority related to election administration. The misinformation and disinformation related to administrations, just because there is no proper channel or proper information from the authority. So then we will create a path for social media people or political party people to bring different information to the public. So that is what we have noticed even in the other administration process from the complex side. The communications channel, it has to be clear, at least for the administrations. But the rest of the things, it's very difficult, but there are some countries who have a monitoring mechanism, have a good communications with the elections commissions, and the social media owners, and some sort of prevention mechanisms. But it's, I mean, in a country like in Philippines, it's a large populations, it's not easy. I wish to comment the previous questions also about this. We were talking about a lot on the machines, right? Now we introduced, I was witness in 2010 also here, the first time when you introduced. But now we run, I think, 6 or 7 elections up to now with the machines. So we need to have a discussions now with all the stakeholders, elections commissions, observer group, the media, and also the public, the voters. Voters is one of the key stakeholders. Whether the purpose now, whatever the objective, why we introduce the voting machines. Do we introduce just because of quick counting or something else, or to accessible for disabled people or any other reasons? I don't know. I mean, you are the people who really know why we introduced these machines. So whether we achieve that objective, and we need to assess that over the last couple of elections and need to come up with proper solutions. I'm changing the machines is a one thing, but beyond that, we need to have that engagement discussions with the public as well as the other stakeholders.
Okay. Disinformation, how big a factor was it? And perhaps moving forward, what can we do to better address that problem in subsequent election campaigns?
Okay. So I guess when we're talking about disinformation, 2 things we have to take into consideration. Somebody or a group actually benefited from this complex, planned, orchestrated disinformation, how do you say that? Well-crafted. Well-crafted. It's a network. And of course, there were those who have been disadvantaged. Okay? But because disinformation, there's an intent compared to when you say misinformation, you just, maybe shared. It was an honest mistake. But disinformation is, having an intent to influence, to entice the minds of the public, or to discredit somebody. So you choose one candidate over another, okay? And also, this information, this web of disinformation, has been supported by big political families or dynasties, okay? So I guess it reinforces. How are we combating disinformation? I think for the most part, it is the watchdogs, it is the fact checkers that are combating disinformation. In the case of Rohan, we were having this conversation earlier. The reason it worked in Sri Lanka, for example, is because the government took a strong stand on it, to do it, right? But I'd like to say that there are occasions when we can say that government itself, is part of this disinformation campaign, disinformation web. In fact, some certain agencies of the government are peddling lies, peddling disinformation and untruths. Okay, so I think we have to look at the entire ecology. Let's try to dig deeper, drill down, and see for ourselves that, the reason that somebody has been propelled to power is because of these factors. It's not an accident. It's actually pre-planned. And we should, I guess where we stand, we should, really understand the ecology, the dynamics, and be ready for a pushback.
Okay. Would you like to add to that, Attorney Rola? I think to make it more, to push the envelope further, there are the results of the elections, and by and large, despite all the complaints, the issues, they are credible, and they have to be respected. But I think what's in the minds of a lot of people is, how did we get to that point? We have an official result, but what happened before that? How were voters manipulated in the context of this ecosystem of disinformation? What can we do?
Right. To answer your question, Christian, on how big our problem is about disinformation, we are in a Marvel universe, cinematic universe. People are in different universes. One sector of the population has this universe, and another sector of our population is in another universe. So, kidding aside, I think we have a big problem of misinformation and disinformation. That's an accepted fact and reality in Philippine elections, in the Philippine society. And to move forward and to somehow temper this problem of ours in Philippine society, one, it's to accept that it's not a simple problem. It's a complicated problem which requires multiple solutions. Solutions coming from the government side, for example, COMELEC, addressing problems or addressing issues on misinformation and disinformation. COMELEC is really good in that aspect in this election. They were able to address right away misinformation, disinformation about overseas voting. Remember when there was an allegation about a pre-shaded ballot given to a voter in Singapore? COMELEC addressed it right away that it was negligence, an honest mistake on the part of one of the SBEIs. So going back, it needs intervention coming from the government. It needs intervention coming from the private society, from the private sector via media information and literacy drives. It was good that a lot of people were doing house-to-house campaigning, explaining the disinformation to the people face-to-face. So we need more of that. And not only during the elections. A lot of people would always tell that public education should be done a year before the elections. But for me, for us in Lente, public education starts the day after the elections. Because a lot of politicians and candidates starting today or starting yesterday, the day after the elections, they're already preparing for the next election, which is 2025. So we need intervention coming from the government. We need intervention coming from private society. And lastly, I think a lot of burden is put on ordinary people like us, on the voters, that we are the trolls, but not much burden or responsibility is placed on the role of PR firms and individuals engaged in political propaganda. So moving forward, as we try to address more this problem, I think we should hold to account these PR firms and individuals engaged in political propaganda. Because at the end of the day, they were the ones who made and laid out this plan on how to control and how to change the narrative to somehow impact or influence how people would vote and voted in the last elections.
Okay, Mr. Averia would like to add to that, and after that, we will go on break.
Okay. Well, what you just mentioned about the different universes, it's multiverse.
Yeah.
The multiverse. And that's, sadly, social media has been weaponized against the people, right? So it's been used as a weapon to attack every sector in society, especially mainstream media. Mainstream media has been demonized with attacks of disinformation, right? So we don't have credible information anymore. There are multiple versions of the information that we get. And like Ona said, we ourselves begin to become trolls when we just share the information without really verifying it first. So we have to learn how to fact check the information first. We cannot rely on somebody else doing it for us before sharing. And that's the problem. That too is the problem for elections. TikTok is the new campaign platform. Right? You dance a bit and you get to win. Right? So the commission must study, have a study done about how to regulate the use of social media in campaigns, in the conduct of the elections.
Okay, that's a ticklish issue, regulating social media in most democracies.
I'm not advocating for regulation of social media. It's how the campaigns will be, how politics will use social media.
Okay, I think even the COMELEC is tiptoeing on that issue, how to monitor and campaign spending on social media, which is a step lower than what we are supposed to talk about already. addressing disinformation. But we're going to watch a couple of videos, and then we will go back to our panel discussion. Don't go away. Okay.
Democracy in the Asia-Pacific region is defined by cultural, political, and economic diversity. Yet recently, authoritarianism has been on the rise, with the most dramatic democratic reversals taking place in Myanmar, Hong Kong, and Afghanistan. And many countries have taken advantage of the pandemic to restrict rights, especially freedom of expression. Moreover, democracy has been eroding, especially in India, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, where ethno-nationalism, polarization, and the militarization of politics have become concerns. Still, there is resilience. Many democracies have successfully curbed the pandemic while respecting democratic principles. And countries from Vanuatu to South Korea and from Mongolia to Australia have managed to innovatively organize free and safe elections. Protests across Asia, despite the pandemic restrictions and authoritarian clampdowns, show people demand a say. Never has there been a more urgent need for democracies to deliver on their promise, rebuild trust in institutions, and prevent more decay. Visit www.idea.int to read the Global State of Democracy 2021 report.
Mga matay imulat, piliin ang nararapat.
Halina at makisali sa diskusyon na ay makisuri. Kaya't sa darating na ika-9 ng Mayo,
Sa pagboto ay maging matalino.
makisali, makisuri. Hawak natin ang bukas, ipanalo natin ang Pilipinas. Makisali, makisuri. Hawak natin ang bukas, ipanalo natin ang Pilipinas. Makisuri.
Okay, welcome back to the third segment of our panel discussion this afternoon. And I'd like to advise members of our live audience to get ready with your questions. We'll start accommodating them later on in this third portion because I think we're extending a bit because of the interesting responses coming from our resource persons. Okay, there's a question from the audience regarding the selection of members of the Commission on Elections. Let me paraphrase that, because here in the Philippines, that is an independent constitutional body, but there are always concerns that the process itself is politicized. Can you talk about, let's say, how the selection is done in other countries? Talk about the best practices, which can probably be adopted here in the Philippines.
Well, you can't expect 100% independence from anybody. So we do have our own politics, whatever your positions. But when you assign or appoint in some positions, especially the elections commissions, so that is one of the critical, the main concern is their independence. So it depends what is the mechanism of appointment. Who is going to appoint the commissions? Do we have an independent mechanism, system to appoint the commissions? Who will increase their salaries and other benefits? Who decide? Whether once we appoint them, whether politicians or head of the state, whether they can remove them, to whom they are responsible. So in my country, we had some independent mechanism to appoint, but the government, they have changed the system. Now it's a president appointing. I mean, there is a so-called independent mechanism, but it's not. But the commission are not responsible for any individual political authority. They are responsible only on the parliament. So they have some independence. For example, I mean, if you get India during elections period, I think most of you know, they can make a bylaws during elections. So all the government official under the Elections Commission's guidance, the police, all the stakeholders related to elections. And they do have some sort of power. And especially the dispute resolutions also is quite critical when it's come to the elections under their responsibility. So the appointment is the main thing. Then sometime the appointment come from the political authority, but there are some rare cases that they act independent, but the very rare cases in Asia, because always it's linked up with the politicians. So if you really want to have independent commissions, you have to have a independent mechanism to appoint them. So that is the main thing. But I think this may be the last round, right? Is this the last round?
Yeah,
right?
but you will have your closing remarks also later.
All right,
yeah.
okay, I will pass.
Okay, Peter, would you like to add to that?
There's not very much I would add about the processes. There are different models for electoral commissions. In some countries, there's a single electoral officer. In some countries, there are groups selected for their qualifications and experience. In some countries, there are groups who are constituted on what I call a mutually assured destruction model. So you have people from both or all political parties, and it's thought that they will somehow cancel each other out. I'm not sure, I mean, there are different models of constitution and different models of appointment. I'd like to make 2 points about, and this reflects the saying in English, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So however the commissioners arrive in their office, I would say there are 2 things. First of all, are they able to leave their previous politics at the door and come into the commission and act in the interest of the best possible election process, not in the interest of any other considerations which are in their mind. And that clearly takes a very independent-minded individual and someone who has sufficient political and sometimes physical courage to take decisions which may not be popular. The second thing that I would say is that it's very, very important for those as an electoral commission to remember that an election is run for the voters, not for the politicians, not for the government, not for the electoral commissioners themselves, but for the citizens and the voters of the country. And I think if you're able to put yourself in that position, which is a very humbling and challenging position, then you have more chance of making progress and doing good in the world, because that should be why you came to an electoral commission in the first place.
Thank you for that. Are there questions from the audience here? Okay. Oh, okay.
On the appointment to the commission, unlike in the judiciary, which has a judicial and bar council, we don't have such body for the commission. Maybe we should have one to vet candidates for the commissioners to serve in the commission.
That's a good point. Let's go to another issue. This was an issue during the campaign, what to do with excess campaign contributions. I think that's considered a gray area in the Philippines. In fact, one presidential candidate admitted that he had kept a significant amount of contributions in the previous election, but he declared he paid the proper taxes for that. What's your recommendation, Attorney Ona?
I think the political party strengthening bill should already be passed in Congress so that there is a vehicle for unexpended funds like that. Because funds like that should go back to the political party so that the political party could make use of the funds to train future leaders, to help out in the party's mobilization efforts. So I think that should be done to pass the political party development bill, political party strengthening bill, so that one situation could be addressed right away for excess fund. It should go back to the political party. Because I remember when this call ran, 2019 midterm elections, he was under a party. So supposedly, he should have returned the excess money to his party.
Okay. The Political Party Development Act,
Yes.
which has been languishing in Congress for
three
so many
decades
years.
already.
Yeah.
Not a priority of our Congress.
Yeah. Malu, would you like to add to that? Okay.
I just want to say this regarding the tone at the top. Okay, so I think if you have tone at the top, so if you have a leader who believes in transparency, good governance, and who values critical engagement, maybe appointing people who are quite independent-minded wouldn't be a problem. Okay, so I think that's the answer to that question.
Okay.
So it's important that we have that kind of tone at the top.
Okay, but in the meantime, legally, Attorney Ona, can candidates who have excess campaign contributions, can they keep those contributions?
Yes, that's according to BIR's memorandum circular about excess funds given to candidates. So legally, they have a document to use to keep the money and just pay tax for it, additional income tax.
Okay. Are there questions from... Okay. Go ahead, sir. Please state your name, your affiliation, and then you may ask the question.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Kaka Suminta from KIPP, Independent Committee for Election Monitoring Indonesia. I'm agree with Peter that the main concern of our election and democracy is voters. So we say about that Vox Populi, Vox Dei, voter come to polling station to vote, and the vote to be sit and the sit to be policy. Regarding what happened in Philippines and other countries, what should be done? The voter voice to be policy that come back to the voters, to the people that in education, economy, healthcare, and so on, so it to be a real tonight election. Thank you very much.
Who would like to respond to that? Okay.
Okay. Thank you for that very good question. I think one thing that we should consider or think about is that elections are actually a reflection of the economic, socio-political landscape. So if we want to have a more transparent, more how do you say that? Ideas, robust, flourishing democracy. We should create an enabling environment for that. And we should also be looking at the issue of poverty and responding to there must be decisiveness in responding to fundamental problems in the country. Because at the end of the day, by the way, I've spoken to some of the voters and they said, okay, we accept it. That's a fact, okay? And why did you do that? Because we needed the money. One of the things that the pandemic brought is that we have seen the inadequacies of our social protection system, our healthcare system, and so people are in a survival mode. And so anyone who could promise them the moon and the stars who could promise them this relief, no? So it's easy for them, no? It's easy for them to right away believe, no? And not to think in very substantial or substantive terms. Okay? They don't have time for that because they're in survival mode. So I guess we have to, look at the entire picture and look at electoral reforms to marry them or to make them coincide with other social and economic reforms. So I think we have to think deeply.
Okay.
So I think there's no singular answer for that.
Okay. Other questions? Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Alexander Schmidt from the German Embassy, and I just wanted to share an observation. When I visited the closing of one cluster precinct, there was a quite high turnout of voters, which is a very good sign. It was for my precinct 756 out of 800. But what was interesting to see is that when it came to the political parties, the majority of voters did not seem to bother to shade for a political party. So I would be interested, why is that, and what would you recommend that voters take more interest in political parties in the Philippines and want to engage with political parties? Maybe it was just a spotlight, but maybe it's also a pattern. Would be interested.
Yeah, would like to answer that. To be blunt about it, we don't have a working political party system in the Philippines. That's it. It's very weak. I think I see Dr. Kiko Magno in the crowd, and he would agree with that. Okay, you can ask or comment also, so they can also respond to those 2 points mentioned already. Okay.
Thank you. This is a question regarding our best practices in monitoring campaign finance by civil society, both in the Philippines and internationally. And the second is, I want to connect it with the disinformation issue about campaign finance. Is there monitoring of who finances disinformation? Because there is an entire political economy right now on disinformation.
Financing of disinformation, and the first point, how to make people care more about political parties than, I suppose, personalities. Okay. Good. Okay.
Well, for the first question that goes into the issue of political party development, our politics here in the Philippines is largely personality politics, right? If you're a celebrity, you land in number one, for example. No? So we got to fix that. We have to educate our voters. We have to develop a sound political party system. The challenge came into play when we introduced the multi-party system, right? And each time, each election cycle, politicians would tend to move to another political party, right? Because then he no longer sees himself as aligned with the political party that he's with, and he sees another, political party that will work with him. Not in the context of maybe principles, but rather who is there in that political party.
Convenience.
Yeah, it's a politics of convenience, so that's a challenge there. In terms of disinformation, and sadly, our campaign finance monitoring starts when the campaign period starts. There's no monitoring of and accountability for pre-election activities. Right? You said addressing the elephant in the room. The bigger elephant is actually the use of social media, not only for disinformation, but historical revisionism by one candidate. Right? And we know, we all know who that is. They started exploiting, right, social media.
We're not familiar with the name. We have no idea.
Name the elephant in the room is Marcos.
Ah, okay. We're shocked.
Right? No, but they started exploiting social media to sanitize the name and the legacy of the predecessor, right? The father. So that's it, no? And all this came into play with Cambridge Analytica. I'm pretty sure that everybody's familiar with that issue as well.
But I think the point is very important. How do you, can you do something about funding, the funding source or mechanisms behind that disinformation campaign?
Well, that's basically the challenge. We don't know. There has to be a mechanism of tracking, for example, troll armies, and they've done that, right? On taking down the network of troll armies. But it has to be. There has to be more that has to be done with that.
Okay. Who would like to add? Okay, Attorney Ono.
I just have a question for Greg. Does your question relate to party list? Not a lot of people voted for the party list position.
Ah, party list. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, party
for
list.
The I think one of the reasons is that a lot of people are not familiar with the party list system, although it has been in place since the ratification of our 1987 Constitution. So there's a need to educate people about the party list system. But given what's happening in the party list now, it's being it's controlled by political families, political dynasties. So I think there's a need to revisit the Party List Act. And although this is like a shot to the moon, it's an impossible amendment to the Party List Act. There's a need to introduce an anti-dynasty provision in the Party List Act to prevent political families and political dynasties to use the party list system as another way to gain more seat and more power in Congress. So that's one of the reforms that we're looking at. And one of the problems that they always say to us is, we don't have a working definition of an anti-political dynasty. We already do. There's one in our SK reform law, so there is a model already. So Congress can't use that reason anymore. So I think that's an answer to your question, Greg, about the party list. People are not that familiar with it, and if they're familiar, they don't like it because it's overrun by political dynasties and political families. Answering the disinformation question, you need to understand how COMELEC monitors campaign finance, the spending of political parties and candidates. Unfortunately, COMELEC's campaign finance office, it's an ad hoc office. It's an office not composed of permanent line items or permanent employees. So they're just contractual employees, and they're doing analysis of reports, for example, by candidates and political parties. To do a complicated work like that, to address or to somehow investigate where the money is coming from, to fund this disinformation networks, this campaign finance office needs more skilled personnel, like data analysts, like lawyers, accountants. Unfortunately, the campaign finance office right now, it's just manned by lawyers and non-accountants and non-data analyst persons or individuals. So there's a need to revisit, and there's a need to capacitate the campaign finance office. The office basically in charge of analyzing and investigating all of these submissions made by our political parties and candidates.
Okay. Okay.
Related to that point, Attorney On, I think one question I have in mind right now is what would compel them to do that? Okay, and I think one of the things that would compel COMELEC and other government agencies would be if we are able to build a constituency around issues that are important to us. So if we think that this information is a threat to democracy, do you agree that it is a threat to democracy? I can't hear you. Yes. So we have to be serious about it, and we have to build a constituency around, number one, combating disinformation. So you need people to be doing the fact-checking. We would like to involve more watchdogs, more fact-checkers, because doing so would compel, I think, it will not be given to us on a silver platter, at least based on my experience.
Okay.
It will not be given to us on a silver platter, we have to build a strong constituency around those ideals that we found dear to us.
Okay.
So if that is what we believe, no, disinformation is a threat to democracy, then we should put our acts together.
We're supposed to end at 6 p.m., but there are still a lot of questions. I think we can extend for another 15 minutes, okay? Are you okay with that? You first.
Hello. Hello everyone, I'm Gab from Contradaya. I actually have a question for our international observers, but for our local observers you can add also. Since Marcos's name has already been mentioned, I guess the current, although unofficial, results of the Philippine elections is leaning more to Marcos and his Vice President Duterte. I actually talked also to my friends, since also to other groups, especially the youth groups. And I guess I could say that we reached into a conclusion that democracy is in danger. So I guess the question is, what shall we do? What shall we do as the youth to, I don't know, what shall we do? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And would you like to respond to that?
Well, it's a good questions anyway, and very critical questions. Yes, we need to serious on that. I think one of us mentioned that name also. So that is why now we know that there was a complaints, and COMLEC has given their answer first round, then the second round also they came up, but after the elections. Now what can we do now? Unfortunately, we have to follow, even though we may clear about the system, even though we may not trust about the COMLEC or other authority, but at the moment, we have to go through the existing legal framework. So we can challenge in the next step at the court. I think that is what we learn. But future, of course, as I mentioned earlier also, we have to make sure the independent commissions take place and all the legal framework, all the power vested with them. So that is in the future. But at the moment, I think only options is challenging at the court.
Okay.
And I wish to add, I think because we don't have much time, one other point also. When we talk about the elections, I mean always we challenge the COMLEC, Elections Management Authority. Yes, they are the responsible, but it's a teamwork. We all are responsible in a different ways. The local observer group, civil society, media, voters. So we all have a role to play, not only the elections period, in the whole process. So vote education is really important. So one day you may have a clean elections, but the quality of the representations, it's like circle. Which one will be the first? The quality representations. You may have a clean pre-fair elections sometime, I'm not sure. But the quality, if you can't find the quality representative, because we are talking about the representative democracy, right? In Asia, in the entire world. But the biggest challenge is the quality representations. So all create with that. So we have to have, I'm humbly request all my colleagues that we have to start that vote education process immediately.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Eric Castillo from the Asian Institute of Management. Well, if you will ask people who are really on the ground, and I agree with the comment of the representative from the
Anchor,
yeah. They would tell you that that 80% of the cheating would happen before the election. Only 20% will happen during the election. And not to undermine the value of this forum, I think IDEA should invest into really studying what happens before the election, not so much about what happens after, because the cheating really happens before. Now, when you look at disinformation, you're only looking at one side, which is disinformation. But there are two other dimensions there, the filtering and the undue promotion. Those are all part of the disinformation. And we should not only be dealing with one. And we know that, disinformation is a given. There is disinformation in Ukraine war, disinformation in Iraq war, and because it is part of the tool, it's part of the menu in strategic communication. So it is for everybody to grasp. Now, if you look at vote buying, and you will ask candidates, they are helpless. They do not want to buy votes, but that's the name of the game. If you will go on the ground, I have been helping political parties and candidates for the last 15 years. I have reviewed election results, actual ballots stolen, analyzed whether the actual vote counts in the stolen ballots were reflective of the result of the ER.
Okay. May we hear the question?
The question is, I see social media as empowering. Never mind if there is disinformation. Before social media, disinformation is done by the dominant media outlets. Now, how would you weigh in on the relevant pluses and minuses of disinformation in the social media, wherein every individual has the power to disinform and to inform, whereas before, to inform and to disinform is only monopolized by the big media outlets?
Who would like to reply to that? Okay.
Okay. I've spoken with some journalists, and they would always tell me what is their role. And their role, and I think that should also include us, is how to do truth-telling. Information that would be relevant to the lives of people. Information that would serve a purpose, right? So I think we have to look at it from that vantage point. So anything that undermines the truth and perverses the truth, no? As an educator, I am an educator, and I would always, tell my students, value the truth. Let us become truth tellers. Let us not peddle lies or untruths, because doing so is not beneficial to our society, both in the present and in the long term. So I think maybe what you are trying to tell us is how to strategically think about information and use it to our advantage, to propel the nation, for us to become more productive. But to say that this information is good, no, I'd like to, I will argue, I will stand here and tell you that is not the way to look at this information. So I hope that is clear.
Okay. There's a question from our audience online. I think this is addressed to you, Mr. Averia. How do you protect machines against cyber attacks? How do you protect the VCMs from cyber attacks?
Well, the system is set up in such a way that the vote counting machines will connect to the network only at the time when it is ready to transmit. And the transmission period is very short. It takes only a few seconds to transmit the election results. It's one. Okay. The election returns, before it is transmitted, they are digitally signed by the machine. And that generates a code that will indicate if there was tampering in the message. That will indicate that, the code will indicate that, right, when we do check it. Second, the election return, before it's transmitted, is encrypted. So an attacker will have to decrypt the election return. Okay.
So in short, it's very difficult to...
It is quite difficult. And hackers, as we know, needs time, you know, to be able to first break into the system, second, to move laterally within the system. To introduce whatever he wants to introduce in the system, whether to manipulate how the software works or how the information is put together.
Okay. Okay.
Hi, I'm Athena from the Swedish Embassy, but I ask these questions as a voter and a concerned citizen. So my first question is, I guess, to sum up our forum, concretely, what should COMELEC do to gain the confidence of voters who have doubts? And second, do our panelists think that we should revisit the qualifications of those who want to run for office? Like at the very least, like they shouldn't be, you know, having lawsuits or criminal charges. And if so, how can we make that happen? Okay, thank you.
Okay. A very fair, valid question, but difficult to answer. Okay. I would like to... Attorney Ona?
The COMELEC needs to be more transparent about their preparations, their efforts, and they need to answer the general public when the issue comes up. For example, on election day, a lot of issues were about the breakdown of the machines, and how I feel that they could have addressed the issue right away. They could have issued out a statement that the voters have two options: leave the ballot to one of the members of the Electoral Board, or for the voters to just wait for the machine to be repaired or the SD card to be replaced. And I was waiting the whole day for COMELEC to say those two options. They're just telling us, the general public, that we only have one option: to leave the ballot to one of the members of the Electoral Board. So I think COMELEC should be more transparent, and they should be more consultative so that people would trust more the system. As to the second question, unfortunately, our Constitution provides for general qualifications. You should be 40 years old, you should be able to read and write, you should be a Filipino citizen, resident of the Philippines for at least 10 years, and registered voter. And being a registered voter, one of the disqualifications is that you need to not have final conviction of imprisonment. So even though you have pending cases against you, just like we saw with some of our politicians, they're still allowed to run under legal favor. To answer your question, I'm still on the side that our qualifications should be as general, as universal as possible. Because the right to run, for me, it's the right of everyone. It's the right of every Filipino. It doesn't help that we have a system that doesn't encourage ordinary Filipinos to run. But that's a different problem that can't be addressed by introducing stricter qualifications for an individual to run for public office.
Okay. Unfortunately, we need to wrap this up, but Mr. Rohana would like to respond to that.
I wish to respond the second part of the questions. We need to make up, yes, true, in legally, you may not in a position to bring some sort of criteria, but of course, as a citizens, you can make that. There should be a public demand. It's a demand and supply. So the political party always looking at the winning horse. So we need to change the winning horse criteria. It's all depend on the demand. If we entertain with the corrupt politicians, yes, the political party will nominate them. So we should have our own criteria. I have experience in my own country. We managed to consult thousands of people across the country and build some sort of criteria for nominations. All the parties agreed and endorsed. But there is an issue again, the implementations. In certain extent, yes. In addition, we prepared a scorecard for voters to assess their candidate. For example, now we are talking about vote buying. We are criticizing the COMELEC. We are criticizing the politicians. If voters reject the money from the politicians, what will happen? So we need to educate citizens. We need to tell them, look, they are giving money, yes, but it's your own money. So what you can do is, you can have that criteria for nominations, and also you can prepare a scorecard for voters to assess their candidate. And end of the day, we can ask them to give some sort of marks. It's not easy, but it takes long time but it all demand and supply. It's a part of the economy.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I think you will still have the opportunity to speak individually with members of our panel. We would like to thank the members of our panel, Mr. Rohana, Peter, Malu, Attorney Ona, and Mr. Abria dito. Thank you for joining us tonight, this afternoon. We hope the discussion has been fruitful. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much to our panelists.